All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Bhargav. I am a UI developer. I've been in ThoughtWorks for 2 years now. And I'll be one of your hosts for this one.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Myself, Ravindra Mahajan. I'll again be one of the speakers for the talk, which we are going to talk about high traffic. How do you actually deliver a good content on high traffic website? So Bhargav will take it up from here and then I'll join in. Thanks, Bhargav.
Thanks, Ravindra. All right. So we are talking about caching high traffic, high volume websites. First, let's start with what is even high traffic. So anyone here, what do you think? What is high traffic? Or anyone from Pune or Bangalore? Pallavi Sharma says log of use. I think she means lots of users.
Yeah. High traffic in Bangalore is traffic what you get on the Silk Board. It's horrible traffic.
You need to meet us in Gurgaon. There is a stretch. I bet you.
That one we won't be able to fix. Sorry, Jagat. But high traffic is when your website, the client and the server needs to do a lot of communication. There are too many requests happening. That is a high traffic site. An example is a finance trading site or an e-commerce site on sale days when there is a lot of traffic coming in. Now, what is a high volume site? Anyone? Okay, Suvik says lots of content. And he's right? So when your resources themselves are very huge, then to load them from the server is going to take some time. So an example of this is a video streaming site or a social media site, which are usually media heavy, lots of images and videos coming in. So what are the problems with high traffic and high volume? The way web is built today, we make requests and we wait for a response. So this causes us to show a lot of ephemeral states to the user. So there is an initial state and there's a loading state, then there's a success or failure state. And the more requests you have or the longer you have to wait for a response, the more you need to do this. And this is not the best experience. So how do we solve this? With the help of caching. What is caching is simply if you've performed an operation before, then you're storing the response of that so that you can reuse it later. And why are we talking about caching? Because we think it is the most underused technique on the front end. With the right caching strategy for your resources, you can make your apps really performant and snappy. With that, we'll start with our first topic, which is HTTP caching. So when your browser makes a request to the server and it receives a response, it stores that response in its memory so that the next request, it can reuse this response. This sounds great in theory, but building apps is really complex. For some resources, you may want to cache. For some, you may not want to cache. And for some, you may want to cache only if certain conditions are met. But why are we talking about HTTP caching? Isn't this like an old archaic thing? This is something that whose spec was released in 1997. So is it still relevant? Should we care about HTTP caching? Let me show you that. Let me answer that with an example. Here's an app where I list where I like to eat. If I open the network tab and I reload this page with disabling the cache, so this is as good as this is the first time I'm hitting this app or site, and now I'm going to enable the cache again. I'll just go back and I'll come forward. You see that it was an almost instant load. This is possible because of HTTP caching. It's not like the browser saved the page in its memory. It actually went and made all the requests again. But because it was available in the browser's cache, it was able to serve them immediately. So to understand how this works, let's look at the spec and some of its headers. So the HTTP spec defines a lot of headers, but these are the three main ones. One is cache control. This is like the boss header that controls the caching strategy for a given resource. E-tag, short for entity tag, is how you version a resource. This is a response header. So this is set by the server, and it's how a server tells the client what is the version for a given resource. And the last one is last modified, which is also a response header, and this is how the server tells the client when this resource was last modified. So using these, let's see how we can cover the most common scenarios. And to understand that, let's look at how browsers actually validate the caches. All right, we'll go back to our demo. And in my network app, let's disable the cache and reload this. We'll look at a sample request. Let's look at this 2.hash.chunk.js file. It made the request and
zoom in a little.
Sure, yeah.
Is it visible to everyone?
Is this visible? Pune, Bangalore? Yes. Okay. All right. So the browser first made the request, went to the server responded with a 200 OK. Notice that the server sent a cache control max age and some number. So this number is in seconds. What the server is telling is, when you take this resource, you can cache this and it will stay fresh for so much time. And we've said 1 year. So the next time I reload the page, noticed that this file was actually served from memory cache. And this is because the browser knows that it is still fresh, and because it was marked as fresh by the previous response. So you can look at its last modified. It was last modified on 6th November 2022. So this will stay fresh till the next year of November. Similarly, let's look at, so this is how max age is used. Using max age and last modified, you can control the cache, like validation. You can do the validation based on age or the time. The other is using E-tag headers. So like I said before, E-tag is how you version your resource, right? So let's look at a different resource this time. Let's look at CSS. I'm going to disable cache and reload this one more time. So we requested this resource, we got a response, and the browser added an E-tag. So the E-tag is basically a hash generated from the contents of the file. So now notice when I disable the I enable the cache and I reload, what happens is my CSS file is requested again. The browser intelligently adds a header if none match, and it uses the E-tag value from the last response, and it sends it to the server. The server gets it, server knows that this resource is not changed. So it just says 304 not modified, which means not modified. So it doesn't even send the response, it just says 304. So even though an actual request happened, but the transfer size is minimal or almost negligible. And if the response had changed, like if the resource had changed on the server, then you would get an actual response with a 200. So now that we know how the browser validates caches, let's look at some patterns to cache resources. Some of your common resources. So for your sub resources, which is the resources that you normally link in your index HTML, a technique that is used widely is called cache busting, which means where what you do is you take the content hash of a file and it add it to the to its URL, to the file name itself. Now, how does a browser identify a resource? By its URL. And when you put the hash in its file name, that means anytime the file changes, the resource URL will change. Using this technique, you can then set the max age to be as high as possible, a safe as high as 1 year. And that way, the browser will not make the request unless the resource has really changed. So this works for all your sub resources, your JS, CSS files, and anything else that you would link them after. And like we saw earlier, when the age itself has not expired, then the browser won't make the request. That this is great for sub resources, but what about main resources? Main resources like your index HTML, your favicons, your manifest or JSON, you can't really decorate their URLs because no one would use a site that says yoursite.com/index.hash.js or HTML, sorry. So you can't really do that. So you can't really cache based on age for your main resources. There are ways to do that. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but using HTTP spec and HTTP caching, a safe bet with your main resources is to use cache control no cache. No cache. What no cache means is, it doesn't mean don't cache. It means cache, but always revalidate before using the reusing the cache. So now let's look at some of the use cases. This is great for static resources, but what if I have a dynamically generated resource and it is authenticated? It is behind a login. In that case, you can use cache control private on the response. So the HTTP spec actually divides caches into two distinct categories, private and shared caches. And like the name says, private caches won't be stored on any shared places like a CDN. A CDN is also a shared cache. So it won't store it there. It will only store it in your browser, and it will store it against some sort of authorization key like a authorization header or a cookie if it is cookie-based authentication. The next use case is, what if my response changes based on arbitrary headers? Suppose your site gets its content from a CMS and you support multiple languages. For example, in that case, the request that your browser would look something like, in the request, there is a accept language header, which says English or Hindi or whatever. So in this case, you can't really, you can't store the same cache for all the requests. So if you want to use that arbitrary header as a key in your cache, there is a vary response header in which you can mention or specify your header name that is used. So you can say vary accept language, and then the browser will store use that as a key while storing the caches. Another use case is, I want to set cache control only for the CDN. So in this case, you might have to look at CDN specs specifically because there is no standardized CDN only header today. There is work being done to make a standardized CDN cache control header, but it doesn't exist today. It won't work. But like surrogate control is one that is supported by some of the CDNs. So you'll have to check with your CDN if that works. And what if the last use case is, what if I don't want to cache at all? Then you can use no store. The browser won't cache the resource at all. So here's a flow chart of everything that I just said. You can use this to define the caching strategy. At this point, I'm going to move to the next topic. Are there any questions from the audience?
Any queries about, in case, I mean, in general, we use these headers a lot, but any queries around when should we use what? or if you have any experiences to share regarding these headers, that how they really work for you. Anything that anybody from the audience would like to add?
See, I have one question on the caching headers. You spoke about cache control, last modified, and e-tag. There's another header called max age. So given I have a last modified, even I have a e-tag and cache control, along with that, if I have a max age, how it works?
So max age is a directive used inside cache control. Max age is the value that you use inside cache control, which is how the server tells the client that this resource stays fresh. When you store it in your memory for caching, it stays fresh for so much time. So it looks, let me show you that example. Like this one, right? You say cache control, max age is so much time in seconds.
Okay.
One more question from Bangalore.
Yeah, actually, it's a very specific use case that I want to ask about. Say, consider an example of Zerodha, right? You're suppose getting data from the backend, and you're plotting a chart, right? Based on that, say, historical data of any, say, stock, right? Now, in one of the pages, I've seen the data in, say, daily mode, right? It has got the data for certain duration, or so maybe monthly mode. It has got the data in daily mode and then sort of done an aggregate locally and created that chart, right? Now that daily data has come. Now I change it to, say, daily mode, right? Is there a way wherein if there is something stored in the cache, is there a context-aware understanding of that cache from which I can fetch pieces which are relevant to what I want to display? For example, if I have the data from, say, January 2001 till 2020 based on the monthly data, right? I'm trying to plot a daily chart, which is just, say, 6 months data, last 6 months, say 2020 ka last 6 months, right? I want to fetch, the data is already there in my cache. Just that I want a piece of that, not the whole thing, right? So is there a context-aware way of getting a piece of the cache? And is it supported by HTTP cache?
So, sorry, I didn't get your name. Who was that?
Yeah, my name is Avnish.
Avnish. Okay. Avnish, so the HTTP spec, you can only cache, and this cache can only be controlled using headers. So one word answer for your question is no, it is not possible. If we were allowed to access the cache from the browsers, it could have drastic security implications. So that is not possible. And I don't think it will.
So all these caches, what Bhargav is talking about, right? These are primarily on the static resources. But Avnish, what I understand is you are looking for a use case wherein the data you get from an API and that being cached, and probably a subset of is what you require to plot something. So I don't think that goes on really well with the caching of the static resources. However, we'll touch on a part of that topic wherein how can you cache the APIs. And in the API, probably you could have a use case wherein you have everything cached, and next time you require it, so you could cache the APIs also in a way, right? So probably in service workers, one of our next topics when we'll get into, Bhargav could help you touch base on that, what is it that you could do about it?
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah.
One more question from Bangalore. It's
Yeah.
Nitin.
Hi, my name is Nitin. I have a query like, do you have any handy examples how you set values for these controls that you just mentioned, like vary, or you want to set?
You can just refer are you talking about the directives used inside cache control? Like how we saw max age?
Yeah, how do you set the values for those controls at resource?
So this is done on the server. Like I've done this for this example, I've done this on my proxy server. I'm using Nginx. So it really depends on the server, but Nginx syntax is quite simple. you would like, I can show you now.
If you want to project something, so while Bhargav is projecting, so there is one answer to it. So every static resource that is served on over the internet, right? There is some form of web server on top of it. So all these configurations are done on the web server. So that web server could either be Apache, could be Nginx, or for that matter, even if you're doing it through CloudFront, CloudFront also gives you an options to define your MAX headers and everything. So this is not done anywhere at a front-end layer. So if you are building, let's say, any of the React, Angular, whatever app, and you think that it's feasible in the static resources, no, it's a configuration done on the web server.
I can't find the conf file right now, but please reach out to me later and I'll help you with that.
One quick question from Pune.
Yeah.
In that example, the cache control is only max edge. So by default, is it public or?
It is public by default, and also the caching mechanism is smart enough. So if there is an authorization header or any kind of way to authorize, if some of that information is present in the response, then it will automatically not store it in any public caches. So by default, everything is public, but if there is an authorization based information in the response, then the shared caches won't store them.
Got it. Thanks.
I think it would be a better practice to explicitly mark it private, even if that happens.
Bhargav, one more question from Bangalore.
Yeah.
I am Kiran Kumar. Yeah. How resilient your cache memory systems are? Can you shed some light upon that?
Could you elaborate a little more?
Yeah.
Resilient in terms of what?
Yeah. In terms of any failure, how resilient? How you are going to handle the cache memory?
Are you asking about clearing the cache when the data is not required, or we would like to get the fresh content? Is that the question? Okay, that's the question. So I'll rephrase once again. So how about cache bursting?
So firstly, it very well depends. I'm sorry, I didn't get your name.
Kiran Kumar.
Sorry?
Kiran.
Kiran, it primarily, it depends on a lot of factors, right? If let's say you are serving a lot of things from the server itself and your caching is built in the web server like Nginx, then they are very resilient, right? So anytime that there's a failure, so the fallback, so any caching mechanism that you have, most of the times they are built with an understanding that if anything is not served from the cache, they'll naturally fall back to the server. And after serving from the server, it is again being cached. Now talking about whatever Bhargav mentioned, right? All these headers are actually honored, respected, and written in the browser, and then honored in the same way by the caching servers, let's say either server or CDN. Personally, I have never seen a problem with the headers and everything. The server, the CDN, let's say, or any server can decide to falter completely on its own, but that will also stop serving your website altogether. So it's not just to do with the headers. Would you like to add something?
No, I think that's covered.
So if that kind of answers you. So from an external entity, we won't have a lot of control. What our primary goal is, we set the headers and expect the other systems to work as is. If the other systems fail, let's say Nginx or whatever, we rely on those systems to come back immediately or something. So that's how it goes. And then we are also going to touch base upon why instead of building your own servers for caching, let's say you could also move to one of things like CDNs and all. So that is also being covered. So probably by the end of this talk, this answer will in a way be answered. This question in a way will be answered by the end of this talk.
Ravinder and Bhargav, there is one more question by Sanket. So just last one that we're taking. So he's asking, let's say if something is cached for a year on user's browser, and I want to clear that cache and revalidate it for all the users. So how we can achieve that?
If it is a shared cache, if it is a shared resource, then yes. The question is how you want to clear it.
Clear the cache and now you want to revalidate it for all the users.
So the next time the request is made from the client, it will be cached again.
So again,
We don't control when it is stored, or we control it only through the headers. We don't explicitly go in the browser and say that store this, don't store this.
so think of it as an example. Let's say you have a CSS which is written as abc.css and your browser has cached it for 1 year, right? And you have written a header of max age equal to 1 year, which is 315360. Now, next time from the browser, if you make this call of abc.css, browser would see that, okay, I have a header which always asks me to get it from the browser. So browser will serve it from the browser. But to answer that, that is not how we usually get our static resources nowadays. Every static resources that we get usually has a hash to it. So it will be something like abc.efgh something, which is a hash.css. So anytime your build system generates new files, the previous name does not matches. So that still says in system for probably the old users, but anytime a new site is loaded, abc.xyz or whatever the CSS is, that will always be fresh. So that's more of a cache busting on its own. The nowadays we don't get into that mode of manually bursting the cache by writing something like abc.css and then question mark date equal to 1, 2, 3. So adding any parameter for that matter would burst your cache. So to answer that, how do you do that? You can add any additional parameter on top of it and expect your CDNs are not caching the additional parameters. It will burst the cache, but not a recommended way anyways now. It used to be like 10 years back how we used to manually burst the cache. There are much better techniques that how do you not cache such resources forever?
Like if you use a tool like Webpack, which you probably do, content hashes, adding content hashes to your resources is very easy. It's like,
so maybe if you could just see on the screen itself, right? This FA, the file which is highlighted, right? It says main.fa8a3f78. So anytime there is a change in the CSS and the Webpack builds is again, this hash itself would change. The chunk name, hash or whatsoever, it will change on its own. So there will be no place wherein you'll see the same CSS again. That is not doable. But if you still have that issue, then you can simply just append any parameter and it will use to burst the cache in previous times at least. But that used to be our manual way when the Webpack and all did not exist.
all right, we'll move on to the next topic, which is service workers. Service workers. So, can someone answer what is a service worker? Have you used? Has anyone used? Can I see a raise of hands? Has anyone used a service worker? I see a few hands. Yeah. All right. So, service workers act as proxy servers. They sit between your app, your web app, and the origin server, like you see in this diagram. Technically, they sit in the client's machine itself, but they run on a separate thread, and they have access to every request that goes from your web app, which makes them immensely powerful and which enables a feature that has not been possible on the web for a very long time, which is offline experiences. Since you can access the requests, you can do just about anything with it. Let's look at that with an example. Here is that same site. And I have some logs added when I am serving it from the network. Now, it loaded it when I see the network tab, it has loaded. Let me refresh this one more time. It's made the request for all of these resources, same resources we've been looking at. Now I'm just going to go offline and reload the page. Notice that you did see a browser's offline page, you saw an actual page. And this is because the resources were cached by the service worker and they were served by the service worker when it could not reach the network. Also, you might wonder, okay, if we do this, how does a user know that they are currently offline? There are ways in the DOM to just detect whether you are online or offline. It's quite simple. For example, in this app, I've made the header gray when the user goes offline, and when I make it its default color when the user comes back online. So how does this work? How did we do this? So service workers have a life cycle of their own. The first thing you do is somewhere at the entry point of your app, of your web app, you register the service worker. The service worker file is just a JS file. So all you do is register that file with that file name. Then when you do that, the browser will automatically install the service worker. You can listen to the install event and do something with it. For this example, I was listening to the install event and I cached all my main resources. Remember from the previous slides, when we saw that HTTP caching, we could not effectively cache main resources. With service workers, that is possible, and we are doing that the same thing. The app shell files are listed in a list at the top, and then I am adding them to the cache later on. If you see the third last line or something like that. Now, after that, what I do is I listen to the fetch event. So fetch event is triggered every time a request goes from your web app and it passes through the service worker. So here what I'm doing is I'm listening to the event and then I'm actually letting the request go to the network. Await fetch does that. And then when I get the response, I take my cache and I open it and I save that response in the cache. So the next time if the request, we try to make the request and it does not succeed, then it goes into the cache, and if it was available in the cache, it will serve from there. So if you are using the cache API, so whatever we did here, caches.open, caches.add, all of this is the cache API that you were able to access in the service worker. If you are doing this, there are three main distinct phases that you need to think about, or parts that you need to think about. One is how to store resources. One is serving files from the cache. And the last is updating the caches. So storing the resources, you can do it on install, like caching the application shell. We saw that with the main resources for our demo. You can do it on user interaction. The DOM itself is not available in the service worker, but you can communicate from your main app, web app, to the service worker using post message API. You can communicate both ways. And one is on network response, which is what we did for all our other resources, all our sub resources. How do you serve files from the cache? There are different strategies. There is cache only, network only, cache falling back to network, network falling back to cache. This is the one that we used for our demo. We went to the network. If it's not there, then serve from the cache. And then there's cache, then network. And finally, updating the caches. So you can either go full update, which means every time the cache changes, or for all the resources, just keep updating the caches, or you can do a changed assets update. So you actually check that if the resource has changed, only then update the cache. You would have to do this if it's a like resource heavy app. And in our cases, it would be for the topics that we've picked, high traffic and high volume. So you can use tools like Workbox that help doing this very easily. At this point, we'll stop and take questions for service workers. Did I lose you? Are you still here?
Yes, we are. Probably that how we could have leveraged that API from the service worker, right, to get the partial data.
Kiran, so until the other people have questions. Kiran had a question in the last session that if you wanted to partially pick something, it would be possible with service workers. But should you do that or not is arguable.
Yes.
It is possible, but I don't think it's a very good idea. Any other questions? Service workers?
Hello, audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, so my question is, so how do we update service worker? Because I started my application, I figure out these are the 5 resources, has to be cached. And over a period of development, I realized, okay, there are more 5 resources, those has to be cached.
Yeah.
So how browser take care of updating the service worker, or what is the strategy to do that?
Yeah, very valid question. And this is also the first thing when I was learning about service workers, this is what I thought about. So if your browser, there is no tab or no session using that service worker. So, okay, let me put it in this way. You change the service worker. The service worker is downloaded by the browser, but it does not immediately start using it. It first checks if there is no one else using the old service worker. If all the other sessions are closed, which are using the old service worker, then the new service worker is registered and installed. So it has to do this to ensure consistency. If it starts to use 2 service workers, there can be a lot of consistency issues.
No, so sorry, no, that answered my question, but my question might be I was not able to give the correct question. So in previous session, correct, you mentioned all the static assets we can cache with the HTTP header. So I would really like to cache my service worker also. To bursting the cache, either I go with the chunking way or putting the chunk name, or I put a expiry as a smaller duration. So if I go with the first, where I'm putting the chunk name as part of the service worker, then how the new installation or the previous service worker which is running will be taken care by browser? Or I shouldn't go.
Usually service worker is not one of those files which you would like to cache. It's like locking an encryption locker and putting that key again in one of the encryption, because it's a more of a hell that we are getting into, that something is cached and the caching information is also present. So I've been into that. I mean, most of the time recommended that since service worker is a very small file, right? You do not cache it and let it come from the server directly, so that you have more control. And at any point of time, if you want to burst the caching for some reason, you can easily do it.
So when we talk about the scale, so I'm building a system where I'm expecting a 400 requests per second. And unnecessary, I'm going to get a request for service worker.js.
Right.
Isn't it? So does it make sense to
what we could do is you keep the time very minimum. If you know that, okay, it depends on the releases. So probably this will be the last question, guys, that we take. So if let's say you know that your releases, they are very particular and it only goes once per week, it's fine to have a service worker cached for 1 week, but then you have to be crystal clear and sure that it does not get it does not go beyond that. So what we did in past is we kept the time very minimum. So let's say 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or 1 hour, and we started experimenting. So there is no silver bullet or silver answer to what should be the number. It depends on a use case. If you see the traffic is too high, probably you could do it for 5 minutes so that traffic still reduces. But again, 5, 10, 20 depends also on how frequent you go for a release. So let's say if a system is like e-commerce, wherein there is a very frequent releases, you would like to keep the number minimum. But something like which only has a enterprise sort of a thing, wherein the releases only go after 1 month, you could come the numbers a little less. So it again varies what a use case is.
Also, we don't need to cache everything in the service worker. We need to be we need to make that choice very consciously what we are trying to cache in the service worker. It is available. It might help us solve some particular use case, but caching everything is definitely not a good practice in the service worker itself. All the resources. Yeah.
Next. If there are more questions around it, please type in the chat. We'll try to answer it. Yeah.
And at this point, I'll pass it on to Ravinder for the next topic.
Thank you. Folks, let me know when you can see my screen. Just how to project it. Can we? Is it visible at all locations? Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, thanks for Bhargav for those points. And moving on, since it's all about caching, we'll also talk about what best leverages we can do with respect to browser in-memory caching. Firstly, we talked about static resources. We'll also talk about how could we cache some of the APIs and make best use of it. So, I mean, trying hard on it, right? When I was preparing the slides, so I was just thinking over past couple of years, what is the challenge that I mainly faced with respect to caching, right? Overall APIs and everything. How do I preserve a response? So is it always a good idea to move between the pages and always get a real-time data? Yes, if your use case is such. But if your use case is not that, probably not. So general challenges, what everyone faces with the API responses and the caching them, right? Is let's say caching, that's the biggest challenge. If you have 3 API calls, those are to be made together, right? What we usually do, what we generally do is we try and send one call after the other, and then and there are better ways to do it, right? Probably sending them in batches could be a better way. Now, if you've even been able to get the data in the API, cache them together, the background syncing, right? How do you ensure that the syncing happens in the background? So at any point of time, the APIs which you have is always fresh, right? So how do you ensure that? How do you identify that particular response from the API is stale now and we need to refetch it in the background? So all these things are probably required to be thought of very well while we're doing the API caching, right? How do we do that? Anybody would like to share their experiences? They've done the API caching. I'm not talking about the server side. Of course, there are multiple techniques, but anyone on the client side, if they've been able to do. Anyone from this group? Or anybody from Pune and Bangalore? Okay. So I'll talk about one of the libraries in this case. So there is no technique as such I'm talking about. I'm going to talk about one of the libraries which came in very handy. And recently it came in our TechRadar also, ThoughtWorks TechRadar also, and moved to adopt state, wherein this library primarily gives you the leverage that at any point of time you have 2 parameters, right? One is cache time, the other is stale time. So what is this cache time and stale time, right? So what is this cache time and the stale time, right? Cache time defines that for how long do you want to keep a resource in your in memory, and stale time defines that, okay, for how frequently do you want to get the data updated. So think of it as a scenario, right? Your stock market, right? Let's take an example of Zerodha. Somebody pointed out Zerodha, right? So Zerodha stock market. Do we really need a lot of stale time? So in such cases, the stale time should actually be 0, wherein you always want to interact with real time. But think of it as an e-commerce, right? In e-commerce, your recently viewed product might change very frequently, but their list of products does not change too frequently, right? So list of products is something that can be put with a higher stale value, and your recently viewed products, your cart is something that can be put as a lesser stale value. So I'm going to quickly demonstrate a few of the things that we've prepared in the demo. I think demo would be more exciting than the talk itself. So let me know if my screen is again visible. Yeah. So I'm going to project a demo which I prepared, wherein we are going to talk about 2 examples. So I'm going to load a website, and I'm talking only about the XHR. So I'm going to load a website. I'm going to open a route if you notice, this route make a API call of entries, right? And it loaded some random values and we just created random cards out of it. Now I'm going to another route with the same set of values, same API calls. You'll notice that it again made a call, right? The data is same, everything. So is it a good decision to make calls every time that you move between the data? Or let's say move between the routes, however, the data is still the same? Depends on use case. There is no single answer to it, but most of the time, if your data doesn't change very frequently, you could leverage these entries or let's say caches. Now, if you'll notice, I go back to the product with cache. It made a call again because the cache time was higher. Now, okay, let's take one more example. I go back to product without cache. So this page does not have any caching of the API. And now I went to the other page. If you notice, there was no extra call made and the page rendered because React query decided to cache it. So I kept the caching time to be very minimum, let's say 15 seconds or something. So React query itself decided that if I get a similar call in 15 seconds, I would go ahead and serve from the same response. So this is what happened. Now think of it if it did not exist. I'll try to navigate between this page. So I'm getting 429. I think a lot of people have hit it or something in the demo. So that's a WAF URL. So WAF does not allow me to make a lot of calls. Hopefully, yes, I'm able to. So now if you'll notice, every time I go into without cache, it's making a call and it's loading every time. See, there is a loader. But anytime I go into with cache, wherein the response is cached in the API, I don't get to make that call again. So this is one of the advantages that in general we notice about how you could cache your APIs on the client side. Of course, do not cache all the APIs. There has to be a use case for it, that when do you cache what. So this is what we are talking about, caching the APIs. Moving on to the slides, right?
Just one question here. So this kind of overrides the E-tag behavior, right?
E-tag is for statics. This is for API.
It's for cache validation, no?
But E-tag is primarily, so what Bhargav told, E-tag is primarily used for static resources, CSS and JSS. That is where we usually use. But this is a plain API.
Normal.
This is a plain API. This is not a static resource. This is what we are using for plain APIs. And React query ensures it has multiple parameters. I just talked about one, right? It has parameter where it can forcefully invalidate and everything. So what I'm talking about is there is a very powerful library in the market, very powerful library, which lets you do a lot of work, the caching, the state management and all. How it helps in state management also I'll talk about. Let's say you move from page A to B, right? In page A, you had some user details. Usually if you go to route B, what you do, you put the user details in state and then access in route B, right? But with this thing in mind, React query, you can be sure that you don't have to do that. You just simply go in a second page, make a call and be assured that there is some other system taking care of your caching. So user detail is present there. So this is, I mean, one of the few of the use cases that we were able to leverage. Now, moving on.
If I can ask one question, quick one.
Yeah.
Just in the context of the question I asked earlier, right, regarding context-aware query, here, is it possible that if the parameters change in such a way that it's a subset of the previous REST API, can we get that subset?
I would say probably, firstly, the query which you had, right? What I wanted to more understand is, was it user specific or was it app specific? So let's say if for a same user, you want to show the monthly and daily reports, yes, this can be leveraged. What you could do is probably while making a monthly call in the background, you could make a daily call as well, and React query will ensure it's always in the database. So now when user quickly switches from monthly to daily, it will not make a call. So what I'm trying to understand from here is your core intent is not to have a lag between monthly and data, right? So that is the end goal. Is that correct?
That is correct. Only thing is the duration is changing. In the case of monthly, it's just 6 months data, whereas it was 20 years earlier.
So what you could do, if probably whatever knowledge I have right now of whatever the use case you said, get the monthly data, put it in the React query cache. Once the user moves on from monthly to daily, you could just filter out the subset and render it again. So eventually you're not making a call again. right? That could be
So
one.
the logic
Or-
will be in the JavaScript itself that way.
Yeah, the logic would be. Or what you could do, you could make the monthly and configure the daily call to go in parallel. So let's say you make a monthly call and then daily call you make in the background. React query will keep it in your cache. And while keeping it in the cache, next time user tries to go to the daily, it will immediately pick. So it will be in split of a second. You'll not even see blink of an eye, and then you can render it. So these are optimization techniques. But can we do it on the CDN or servers? I doubt it. So if you are asking me, probably there is a static data which entire world needs to see. Then probably not. You can't do it on the CDNs, but user specific, you could do it on your machines.
Okay.
On the
And React query can only be used in the browser, right? I cannot use it in a like a client application or so, right?
I mean, it's a node. It is a node. I have seen using people it on the node as well. It's just one of the techniques of making an API call, like Axios or Fetch or something. I'm not sure if it can be if it support everything on the node server. I'm not sure. Maybe if someone has an experience, I primarily have used it for the client.
It's primarily built for the client.
Yes.
And this is exactly to give you access of the cache, right? Like the person asked, I want to take something from a previous cache and filter out a subset. That is possible with React query. Because the HTTP cache did not give you access. That is why something like this was built, so that you have access.
Right.
Okay,
And this would be the last question that we'll be taking
Yes.
from talk.
Right. We will,
We
yeah.
can keep in the
Probably
podcast.
you could ask your queries, everything on the chat, and then we should be able to answer it post. Running a little behind time. So yeah. So caching validation strategies. Sorry. So I'm talking about use cases for caching APIs. What are the use cases? We already talked about listing page being one. Let's say you are on an e-commerce, any major e-commerce. Somebody had mentioned about Amazon, right? So let's say there are products with a particular search which does not change. I'm not saying it happens. I'm saying let's assume that it happens. So do you really need to change it? No, you could cache the result on the user machine, let's say for a few seconds or a minute. And next time also user does the same search. It does not make a server call and it gets the data from the client itself. Similarly, trending products. So trending products is also something that does not change over a minute, right? That takes around an hour or something. So trending products also is one of the API that can be cached. Navigation menu, again, if you seen any of the big e-commerce giants, right? They have a static menu or the navigation menu that does not change very often. That does not change every day also, right? So probably these are few of the use cases that can be used. User profile details, arguable, should we or should we not? But generally, it's only your phone number is something that you would change once in a lifetime in your profile or an address, not too much. So that's again one of the use cases. Moving on, things which are definitely not the use cases is cart items. So let's say I bought an iPhone and I then bought a sweatshirt and then I decided to buy a shoe, right? So carts, they change very frequently, right? It's up to user. So there is external person who's controlling it, right? So cart is probably not one of the examples that you would want to use. Similarly, checkout page. Why checkout page? Because in checkout page, whatever responses you want, you usually would want it to be real time. So give me a show of hands that how many of you have actually seen that you bought an iPhone for 43,000 and when you went out to a checkout page, it became 44,200 because the prices have changed, just like flights, right? Airlines. So, flights, it's very common. You go to any site and then by the time you are on the payment page, the prices have increased, right? Of course, it does hurt, but then you can't do much about it. So those are not the use cases. So similarly, search results, because product owners or the managers can decide to add any products at any point of time and recently viewed products. So these are a couple of examples wherein we should not leverage querying or the caching of an API. So again, React query was one, which was one of the most famous ones in the market right now. There are other also. Maybe you could read about it on the internet. So next topic that we are going to talk about, which is again one of my favorites, and why we feel it's really important. The CDN caching is really important on the front end, right? Because whatever else that we talked about so far was more on the code level things that you could control. But then somebody once told me a couple of years back that the performance which you could get from, yes, SWR, of course, that is again one of the pieces that we want to work with in future. So yeah, somebody once told me that there is so much you can do on the code, but leveraging infra would actually speed up everything. And we'll show you an example for that. So what is CDN? So CDN is, think of it, all of us in the room, right? We are all carrying a dongle. So there is, let's say, an internet in this place, and then you are also given a dongle alongside that. Okay, you go anywhere and you have an internet present, right? So all these locations which you see, CDN, POP, CDNs. So what happens? Anytime you cache a resource on the CDN, right? That could be S3, that could be on the Azure or anywhere. It immediately replicates that resources into all edge locations. So if you uploaded a file into a CloudFront in India, you'll notice that even if you access it from the USA, right, you'll immediately get it. And there are headers which tell you that where it is being served from. In the USA also, it can be served from Chicago, New York, or anywhere. So probably there is a joke, right, in Delhi, Gurgaon, that if you are staying in Janakpuri, then CDN is next door. So that's again one of the things. So CDN, they let you have the resources quickly from anywhere. They are replicating all your static resources to your nearest locations. And we'll show you an example that how powerful it is. Let me go to the example directly. So I have two sites. One which is being served from the CDN. So let's see first, which is not served from the CDN. So this site is just behind a regular web server. There is no CDN written on top of it. I'll try and load this site simply. You notice, it's horribly bad today, but yeah, you notice the main file, right? This particular file took 5.98 seconds to load. And it's not that heavy also. If you just notice this file, this is like main.js. So this must be like what, 200 something KBs, 250 KBs, but it took 6 seconds, right? And which is a huge number. So if you every 100 milliseconds that you lose a lot of customers, a lot of conversion, right? And now clearly observe the same site. If I serve from CDN, the same file got served in 20 milliseconds, right? So there was a difference of 300 times, right? So I'm not quoting that it's actually that much different. So maybe it's loading from somewhere else in USA and all. But what I'm trying to tell you is this 20 milliseconds, you keep refreshing, it won't be too much. It will just go to 100, again come back to 40 or something, 16 milliseconds or something. And in the best case scenario, for the file that is served from the S3 or let's say anywhere, it's still taking 3. So the advantage, what CDN gives you, it picks up your static resources, replicates across the world. And as soon as you make a first hit, it caches it on the CDN servers, and then boom, you get it in few milliseconds. So this is one of the most underrated technique that we do not use and should be used everywhere, any project, anywhere. So, this is not just that can be used with AWS. All the cloud providers gives you the ability. And if you notice 18 milliseconds versus, and this is again disabled cache, versus 6 or 5 or 4 seconds, it's not even comparable. You are getting it instantly in a blink of an eye. So that is the advantage which everyone gets from using CDN. Moving on, we are just comparing few of the CDNs, the data from the internet. You can just read it, but still I'll just tell you at high level. There are 4 major players: AWS, Google, Cloudflare, Akamai, and then there are more in the market, right? You can put it on the chat. They all provide the similar support, similar sort of support, wherein you can cache all the content on the CDNs, fetch it from the CDN, they are rendered instantly. And the best part is the CDN consumption is not very expensive. It's usually like 1 million requests and you pay few dollars. So it's a trade-off, right? Do you really want to lose your customer, or you just want to pay few bucks to get your customers inside? So those are a couple of facts about CDN. The benefits, of course, we talked about. It's faster. We can also talk about it provides optimized content. So somebody may question me that how does it provide the optimized content, right? So the CDNs by default nowadays have an algorithm in them that they would identify your browser, and on the basis of a browser, they would tell you whether you need a Brotli compression or a gzip compression or what sort of compression. So they would, according to your browser headers, serve you the most optimized file. So if you'd notice the same file, which was served here for 252 KBs, when CDN served me the same file, it came out to be what, 75 KB. So nothing I did. All I said that CDN, I'm giving you the files, please handle it at your end. Not all CDNs may provide you with that, but yes, this is what will happen. Yes, of course, what Jagat had also mentioned is again picking up. So Jagat, yeah, thanks. So those are a couple of things that we wanted to talk about CDN, and that would conclude our talk as well. Any queries? I can take up to one question if somebody has one question, probably, because we are literally out of time. Somebody
One
has.
from Bangalore.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Ravinder. This is Sukesh.
Yeah.
So I have one query regarding CDN. Suppose there is a user who is facing an issue in the front end, and he reports that issue to the developer. So there is lots of time being consumed between updating or means fixing that bug and issue. So how could we decrease that? Because CDN takes time to get the update from the main server.
Okay. Every CDN, if I understand your question correctly, a user has said that, okay, there is an issue. Developer has identified the issue and he wants to get a next build quickly, correct?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
So one simple answer is simple, what you should be doing, right? As we talked about, right? Build system gives you every file name separately. So CDN caches on your file name. So if your first build had file as apc.js, the second build would naturally have name as apc.xyz.js. So firstly, CDN would have two caching, 1 and 2, right? So anytime you promote a new build from your index.html, it will always be a new CSS or JS file that will be rendered. But let's say for some reason you are still on the older tech stack and the older build version, wherein you are still using abc.js. So every CDN on the planet gives you an explicit cache bursting technique, wherein you can just log in or make an API call for the cache bursting, and all the cache that they have, they'll burst it immediately. So there'll be no caching, and next time when somebody makes a call, it will be served from the server and then cached on the CDN. So that is something which we used to do 10 years back.
Oh, okay. Yeah. My query.
But ideally, you will not have this scenario if you're on a modern tech stack of React, Angular, and Webpack in between, or any sort of thing.
Ravinder, there was one question from Pune. I think I put it in the parking lot for caching, so you can ask it.
Shall do you want me to answer it?
Yeah, it's a quick one, I think.
Yeah, I mean, could you spell it? Could you read it out for me? I'm not able to find it.
No. We are going to talk about that.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes.
So the techniques which we saw were for the static content, right? But if we see the OTT platforms like Hotstar or streaming platform like Netflix, which sometimes stream the live content. So is there any technique to handle the high traffic and high volumes for those kind of platforms?
See, anytime, so that's a separate, I mean, that you are talking about infra and scale. So anything which is live, you of course cannot cache it, right? But if you see what they do as they serve the stream, and this is again, don't quote me anywhere, I'm just talking from my experience since I have a couple of friends in Hotstar especially. As you're moving, right? As you're moving with the live version, they keep caching the content, they keep caching the stream which has passed already. So this is what they do. With live, you will actually not be able to. So we are talking about only one concept of caching, but how Hotstar scales it at millions of users per and all, I think it's a magic of their infra. They have their infra scaled up everywhere and everything. I may not be the best person to answer that, honestly. I mean, I don't want to give you any wrong commitments or wrong statements about it. Video platforms, I may have a little less exposure. Maybe somebody from the audience itself, or maybe Vishal, Jagat, or anybody, if you know that, how do you do a huge, I mean, concurrent multi-million video platforms to stream and still be able to perform best? If somebody knows, I may not have a correct answer.
No, same here. I'll park.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.